This is Mornings on Sky News. One enormous story this morning. NASA has successfully launched its long-awaited Artemis II mission to the moon.
Yes, 4 astronauts are now in space on the furthest journey from Earth that humans have ever attempted.
10, 9, 8, 7. RS-25 engines lit. 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition. And liftoff. The crew of Artemis II now bound for the moon. Humanity's next great voyage begins.
Good roll pitch.
Roger, roll pitch.
Houston now controlling the flight of integrity on the Artemis II mission around the moon.
Integrity, AMT high.
AMT high.
On time passing 30 seconds into the flights. Integrity passes the alternate beacon. Target milestone. Mission Control Houston seeing good performance on the 4 main engines at Space Launch System core stage. Integrity, 3 miles in altitude. Traveling more than 1,200 miles per hour.
Well, the crew began their journey to the launch pad by greeting their families as they left the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building in Florida.
So the astronauts had been in quarantine there for the last fortnight, and that was to stop them getting ill. There was a lot of excitement from the crew and those around them as they said their goodbyes. The
crew then entered the spaceship, the Orion, the only part designed to return to Earth. They were strapped in by NASA technicians and then performed checks and readied themselves for the journey into space as the ground control team did their final checks.
For all personnel, this is the NTD conducting the Artemis II launch readiness check. Verify ready to resume count and go for launch. OTC.
OTC is go.
STC.
STC is go.
GTC.
C's go.
MCO.
CO's go.
Safety console.
Safety console is go.
LPE.
LPE's go.
RTD.
RTD's go.
Houston flight.
Houston flight is go.
ROC.
ROC is go.
And CDR.
Crew is go.
Copy that. Thank you, Reed. And Launch Director NTD, our launch team is ready to proceed at this time.
10, 9, 8, 7. RS-25 engines lit. 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition. And liftoff. The crew of Artemis II now bound for the moon. Humanity's next great voyage begins.
And then they were
Good roll pitch.
After 8 minutes, they reached space,
Roger,
and they're
roll
now
pitch.
in orbit.
They'll remain there for one day. Let's take a listen to the 4 astronauts settling into their new home in space.
All right, Amy, welcome on board the Integrity spacecraft. We got, right now, myself and Christina are in seats 1 and 2, getting ready for rendezvous and proxops demonstration. Victor's just finishing up getting out of suits and getting suit drying going, and Jeremy is hard at work in cabin configuration. It was an amazing ride uphill. The views, we've got 2 moon rises that we've had so far, and the views of planet Earth. We've circled it completely, and we forgot how beautiful it is to look down on Earth.
Well, after the successful launch, NASA gave an update to the press about the rocket's progress.
NASA is back in the business of sending astronauts to the moon. We arrived at this point through a sustained effort and national commitment and the work of thousands across the agency, our industry partners, and our international allies. We've certainly been here before. We know the challenges ahead. We have a lot of checkouts to get through before TLI. And when, if all goes well, everything is go, Artemis II will be moonbound. You have our commitment to keep the public as informed as possible on this historic mission. And we will celebrate when this crew, we will hold our celebration until this crew is under parachutes and splashes down off the west coast of the United States.
Let's tell you a little bit more about the Artemis II crew. 4 astronauts taking part in the 10-day mission around the moon.
Well, the mission's commander is 50-year-old Reed Wiseman, an engineer and US Navy veteran. He launched to the International Space Station in 2014. He spent 165 days in space.
He's joined by 49-year-old Victor Glover, the mission's pilot. He was the pilot on the first operational SpaceX crewed Dragon flight to the International Space Station. He's racked up 168 days in space and is the first African-American, indeed the first person of colour, to fly beyond low Earth orbit.
There are two crew specialists. One of them is 47-year-old Christina Cook. Once an explorer of the Arctic and Antarctic, she lived and worked on the ISS for 328 days. She's the first woman ever to travel beyond low Earth orbit.
The only non-American on the flight is 50-year-old mission specialist Jeremy Hansen. He's the first Canadian to venture to the moon and the only crew member to never have been to space before. Well, let's explore all of these moving parts in a bit more detail. We're delighted to say we're joined by Britain's first ever astronaut, Helen Sharman, who's with us this morning, and our science and technology editor, Tom Clark. Great to have you both with us. Helen, just to sum it up for us, I've seen that clip of the takeoff now multiple times this morning. I find it extraordinary watching it back every time. It must be particularly extraordinary for someone who's been there, done that.
I mean, this rocket is so much more powerful than any other human-rated rocket. So, yes, all of us astronauts can remember what it's like launching ourselves. And we have a similar G load on our bodies, so 4G that's the kind of G that I experienced during launch, which is what the astronauts experienced in this SLS rocket. But they will have done that will have been sustained for a bit longer. And just the sheer power of those solid rocket boosters. So, yes, we saw the RS-25 engines, so these are all shuttle engines, actually, but we saw them igniting. They give you quite some thrust, but these solid rocket boosters, you saw that as soon as they ignite, boom, the rocket's off.
A really powerful moment in so many ways. And Tom, just tell us about the significance of this. It's the first time that NASA has sent astronauts to the moon since the 1970s.
That's right.
So how big a moment is it?
It's a huge deal. I mean, it is fair, and people are saying, well, haven't we done, we've done this before. You know, why spend tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions by the time they've delivered all the objectives of this thing, to do something and go somewhere we've been before? But I think it's important to say they're going differently. The idea now is to establish a sustained presence on the moon, establish a base there. This rocket is bigger and more powerful because it's carrying more loads than the Apollo missions did. And there's going to be a whole bunch of other hardware and habitation stuff they're building to establish that presence on the moon. So they're really going further and beyond. But it's significant too because it's not easy. You know, it wasn't easy back in the 60s. It doesn't make it, the physics of it don't get easier today, even though the technology is much improved. So just the sheer fact, I think Thomas really echoed this last night, of the fact we're going that far once again is something you can't not be completely awestruck by. I mean, the fact, and I think I'm right, Helen, that, I mean, they're at sort of 50,000 miles above the Earth. They're in a high Earth orbit now. I think they're already the furthest humans have been for 50 years in space anyway, because since the Apollo mission, since we were sending people off in the direction of the moon, all of our crewed spaceflight has been in low Earth orbit. Not that that's not a fantastic, wonderful thing to do at all, but they're already significantly further than that.
And obviously some very experienced astronauts, one who's never been to space. What's going through their mind at the moment? And this has been tested, this type of spacecraft, but not tested that extensively.
This is only the second ever flight of this particular rocket, this SLS, Space Launch System. There's been modifications made to the rocket, to the spacecraft as well, since it was first tested without crew. And of course, you can't test it properly anyway unless you've got people in it, because you can't test the life support systems. So, for instance, one of the many, many tests that they're doing on it, about this sort of this human spacecraft interface, is their life support system. They're breathing out carbon dioxide. So clearly we need to clean the air of carbon dioxide. We've got amine filters, which have been tried and tested on the International Space Station. That's great. They will absorb the carbon dioxide. We pretty much rely on that. But the difference this time is that they're venting that carbon dioxide out into space so they can recharge their amine filters, reuse them. But what sort of effect will that have on the trajectory of the rocket itself? So when they do their exercise, for instance, one of the things that they're going to be doing when they wake up after their second sleep today, they're going to be pulling on a flywheel. That will create vibrations. How will that affect not so much the trajectory of the spacecraft, but perhaps the big solar wings that are out there that could be quite floppy? So how will that affect them, and will it affect the rest of the structure? What about the other acceleration, the little tiny G-loads, different parts of the spacecraft? Huge amount, just because there are people in there, let alone it's a new spacecraft.
Fantastic. And which kind of brings us on to the bigger aims of this whole project. I mean, this is really kind of like a technical dry run, in a sense, isn't it? Testing out what they can and can't do with an ultimate aim of landing people, putting people on the moon.
It's a test flight. It's to see that this hardware works. You know, we're talking about them heading off to the moon. They're not even going to do that unless they're very, very happy that everything's working on that. There's a meeting later today at NASA to decide, are we happy with all the systems as they look before they make that commitment? Because obviously once they're headed off to the moon, they're not coming back for the duration of the 10-day mission. So another 8 days from when they make that choice, they've got to be really certain. So it's testing that hardware, ensuring that it works, and figuring out what lessons can we learn from this that will inform future missions. The factors that Helen was mentioning, the sorts of radiation exposures they're going to get, the sorts of wear and tear on the hardware, how often can we run these things, how can we repeat it? And then, yes, the ultimate goal is to, they use this term cadence, we hear a lot, the cadence of these missions has to increase a lot if they're going to deliver on this ultimate objective, which is establishing a lunar base on the South Pole. And there is now competition from other countries, China leading those, but India, Russia, others are also quite interested in the lunar environment and what we might find and develop there.
Tom, Helen, obviously stick with us. Let's bring in now Chris Lintott. He's the Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Oxford and joins us now. Professor, great to have you back on the programme. Tom just alluding to, of course, the ultimate mission here of establishing a base on the south side of the moon. Why do we want to do that? What will we find there?
Well, I think it's one of the most interesting places in the solar system. The south pole of the moon was hit by a large impactor maybe 2, maybe 3 billion years ago, and it created this huge depression. So there's fascinating science to do about the history of the solar system. It's also a logistically useful place. We think there's water incorporated in the lunar soil down there, and from water, obviously, that's useful for astronauts, but you can also make rocket fuel from it. So if we want a staging post to explore the rest of the solar system, that's the place that everyone's thinking of. I have to say, I mean, last night's mission was amazing. I'm following along avidly, but I think we're a long way from a base or a landing. The best case scenario is a couple of years before a landing, and much of the technology needed for that hasn't even been tested once yet. In particular, we don't yet have a lander capable of taking astronauts down to the surface. So this is a good start, but there's lots more work to do.
And a lot of people watching might think, well, I'm really surprised by that. We saw people walking on the moon in the 1960s. So why has there been this long gap, and why this impetus to try to do it again now?
So I think it's partly money. These are expensive missions. I think the cost for last night's mission or for the mission that's underway now is about $4 billion, which is a lot of money for any space program. It's also, I think, this ambition. I think the Apollo era was inspirational and fantastic, but it was about putting a flag on the surface, picking up some admittedly very useful rocks and bringing them back. Here, if we're going back, there's a real sense from all space agencies that we want to go back and stay and make a presence in and around lunar space. And so that's a much, much more complicated mission than anything that was attempted 50 years ago. And it's enabled by the capabilities of the modern rocket that we saw work so well last night. And also, I was really struck by, this is a 21st century mission with computing. There was so much data being transferred back and forth from astronaut to ground and ground back to spacecraft. Whereas, you know, my mobile phone can outperform the Apollo era computers. So this is a highly advanced rocket, very different from what we had before, even if it looks the same and it does the same job.
Professor, who are the best at this? And I guess it's happening with some international partnership, but at a moment, of course, on Earth where tensions are rising. Are the Americans comfortably ahead or not?
Well, I think we do have a space race. That's one of the reasons that I think this is happening now, in that China has plans to go back to the moon. They've sent an amazing set of uncrewed missions, including, for example, the first return samples from the far side of the moon, which have been scientifically fascinating. Their plans for crewed missions to the moon are relatively obscure, at least outside China. Dates in the early 2030s are bandied around. So there is a race going on here. But we should remember this isn't just an American mission. There are contributions, obviously, from the Canadian Space Agency, but also the engine that's currently active on the spacecraft is the European contribution from the European Space Agency, which, of course, includes us in the UK. And it's that engine that will make a burn later today to raise the orbit still further, and which will make the burn that will hopefully, in the early hours of tomorrow morning, send the astronauts into their trip around the moon. So this is an international mission. For all the American flag waving and you know, NASA's pride in what they're doing, this is a cooperative mission.
And Chris, you're a professor of astrophysics and far too young to remember the moon landings from the 60s. But do you think that young people today watching this will be inspired to follow the kind of career that you've had, or perhaps that Helen has had, by watching this? I mean, how much is that part of this, inspiring young people to get into science?
It's very striking. When you listen to the astronauts, they tell you that's why they're going. The point of doing this is inspiration rather than any particular scientific return from this mission. So I hope it is inspiring. I think there is a difference between a mission like this, where we've had people come together and it's a big international, national effort to do something that's astounding, compared to sort of the recent space coverage, which has been essentially billionaires in space yachts tootling about low Earth orbit. It's clear from talking to kids that that's not inspirational. I'm hoping a collective mission to do something extraordinary like this. And the bravery of the astronauts sitting on top of this thing, I think, must be inspiring.
Well, Chris Lintott, really lovely to hear from you this morning, Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Oxford.
Yeah, certainly seems very inspiring. You certainly got a little bit of a laugh and smile from Tom and Helen here with us to that last answer. We're going to continue our discussion with them in just a moment. But first, let's just relive that extraordinary excitement from last night. Thomas Moore reports from Florida.
Lit. 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition. And liftoff. The crew of Artemis II now bound for the moon. Humanity's next great voyage begins.
NASA's most powerful ever rocket rose from Launch Pad 39B on a fiery tail. Its first flight with a crew on board, 4 astronauts having the ride of their lives.
On, pumps fully on.
5 hours earlier, they were zipped into their survival suits. Victor Glover, Christina Cook, Canadian Jeremy Hansen, and their commander Reed Wiseman. They emerged from the building where they'd been quarantined in the run-up to launch, cheered by their families. A last chance for goodbyes, 4 humans leaving behind their earthly ties as they began their epic journey. They were greeted at the launch tower by the team that would strap them into the Orion capsule, no bigger than a camper van, and their home for the next 10 days.
For the entire crew, ComCheck on Orion to Earth 1.
Then, with 10 minutes on the clock, the launch director, the first woman in charge of a moonshot, rallied the crew.
On this historic mission, you take with you the heart of this Artemis team, the daring spirit of the American people and our partners across the globe, and the hopes and dreams of a new generation. Good luck. Godspeed, Artemis II. Let's go.
10, 9, 8.
Then liftoff.
RS-25 engines lit.
8 million pounds of thrust pushing the mammoth rocket skywards.
I can feel the rumble coming across the water there. Extraordinary sound. The vibrations in my chest. That bright light, the fiery trail. It's crackling. That is the most extraordinary sound. The crackle as the rocket powers off the ground. You can feel it in your chest. And the bright light, it's almost like the sun.
Technical problems forced the cancellation of launch plans earlier this year, but this was textbook. 8 minutes later, the main engines cut out, and they were in space. But the NASA chief can't relax yet. What were your feelings watching your crew rising above Pad 39B? And do you feel that extra sense of responsibility for the crew as they head further into space?
It is far less stressful to be strapped into the rocket than to be responsible for it here on Earth. So I definitely had those feelings quite a bit. But, you know, you derive a lot of confidence from the process that leads up to this moment.
2 German astronauts had added interest in the launch.
Just seeing this rocket light up and then being 6 kilometers away, right? Sound takes almost 20 seconds until it arrives, and then when it's there, it just hits you like a sledgehammer. It rattles, it shakes you.
One of them will get the first European seat on a future mission, perhaps landing on the moon.
I'm just loving the smiles on your faces. So you really wanted to be on board, right?
Definitely. It's like it's a perfect adventure, and it's the beginning of a new era. I think most people don't realize, like, from today on, like, mankind will return to the moon.
The crew are on a 700,000-mile test flight to loop around the moon, already in an orbit far higher than the International Space Station. A chance to soak up the experience before heading into deep space later today.
It was an amazing ride uphill. The views, we've got 2 moon rises that we've had so far, and the views of planet Earth, we've circled it completely, and we forgot how beautiful it is to look down on Earth.
The mission has already made history. For the first time, a woman, a person of colour, and a non-American has left low Earth orbit. NASA is going back to the moon, this time far more representative of all humanity. Thomas Moore, Sky News, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Well, Helen and Tom are still here with us, and I think we can see some of the latest pictures that we have got that we can play out to people now. But as we look at those, tell us, Helen, a little bit about what it's going to be like for the astronauts inside that capsule, and especially perhaps for Jeremy Hansen, who, for him, it's a new experience.
So they're really starting to adapt now to feeling weightless. The body is amazing, actually. So our body fluids, instead of being pulled down towards our feet by gravity, as we're accustomed to on Earth, our bodies adapt by having a bit more fluid in our upper chest and head. Last 2 or 3 days, you feel a bit bunged up, but then after 2 or 3 days, the body adapts to that, redistributes the fluid. You might lose a bit more in the toilet, and you feel a bit more normal. But there are some changes that continue. So the astronauts will be continuing to investigate that. But that's a continuation of really what we know a lot of from International Space Station. But no, for Jeremy, you're right, he's not felt that before. He doesn't know if he's going to feel sick. So without taking any anti-sickness medication, about half of all people who go into space not actually feel nauseous, but actually vomit. So it's just this idea that it's motion sickness. It's the same kind of thing, because your balance system in your ears is sending your brain the same signals as it was before. It affects the vagus nerve, and we feel not well. So, and of course, if you're not feeling well, then generally you're not being able to work very efficiently. So hence why it's really good to take some of the drugs sometimes to feel as best as you can. But Jeremy, he just is learning. He's been great in the training, so a lot of what I've noticed in his interviews, he has mentioned things like, well, you can see it's a bit cramped here, but when we feel weightless, we'll be able to use all of this space. All of this room inside the spacecraft.
And he's very tall, isn't he?
He's amazingly tall. He's the tallest one, and he's very aware. He's acutely aware of his size. It's not so much his seat to head height, so much, but his legs are really long. So he will have felt that quite a lot, sort of bending up in the seat. And of course, whenever he has to manoeuvre, whenever he's doing the exercise, when he's doing some of these big lifts, and sort of the squats and so on, and then standing up, his head will be going right up into the docking port. So yeah, he's going to have to get used to all of that, and they'll have to cope with him as well, of course.
Yeah, work around him.
Tom, tell us what's on the agenda for them in the coming days, and how long of the whole 10 days, how long does it take to go from Earth to the moon?
So it's 4 days-ish to get out there.
Quite a long way.
And back. It's quite a long way, and let's remember they're going very fast. 220,000 miles to the moon or something like that, 230. It obviously depends on where it is in its orbit and their trajectory. But yeah, it's a long journey, and it takes time. So they've got a bit of time to not kill, because they've got a lot to do in that time. So when they wake up, they're jumping on their exercise machine. This is not like on the ISS where there's space for lots of equipment. They basically have to unpack a kind of folding flywheel type device, allows them to do some sort of rowing machine type stuff and some resistance exercises. So that's important for their well-being, but also to test life support things on the mission. As Helen was saying earlier, that's going to have knock-on effects on other systems. They want to check everything is working well, dealing with the impacts of other things. They had some telemetry issues we were just hearing about in the press conference earlier. They're trying to solve. Once they're happy, and only if they're happy, the next big step is the translunar injection burn, as it's known, and that's a burn from the rocket. On that live picture we were just seeing, that was the back end of the spacecraft. The Orion capsule's on top. What we can see there is the end of the European service module, and that's the thrust of the rocket that's going to send them off towards the moon. But they won't do that unless they're sure it's all working.
Incredible stuff. We are out of time. Tom and Helen, thank you so much for taking us through day one of this extraordinary mission. We will, of course, have regular updates and regular special programmes at 9:30 every morning.